I learned about Louis Jimenez's story. A friend of mine sent me an email that had the information about a news story about undocumented immigrants who were being deported by private hospitals as I was entering my third year of law school and was specifically taking health law. So it was an interesting series of cases that was applicable to what I was studying in law school. So when I first read the story, I wasn't immediately drawn to Louis Jimenez per se. I was more interested in the concept of human dignity and human rights. And so my initial question was, would it matter the status of someone's citizenship or who they were within society to whether they should receive life-saving medical treatment? And so that was kind of the larger question that I was interested in which position would the courts take and where did the law come down? So Louis Jimenez was a Guatemalan immigrant who comes from a Mayan community in the highlands of Guatemala. And during the 70s, 80s, and to some extent the early 90s, there was, some people would call it genocide, other people violence, right? Political violence against Mayan communities, more or less for allegedly cooperating with communist rebels against the government of Guatemala at that time, and the CIA was involved in some ways in helping arm and train the soldiers who committed atrocities against the Mayan people. So one of the fallouts of that was that a large amount of Guatemalans came to America thinking that they could get support and help. So Louis Jimenez was one of those individuals who felt obligated to come and make a better life for him and his family, which was pretty common, I found when I went there, of migrants who come into the United States without documentation, work for a period of time, and then come back with the money to help build the village or town. Louis Jimenez arrived in a place called Indiantown in Florida, where a large number of undocumented immigrants come and kind of organize. He then got a job working in the fields, mostly for fruit companies. It's unclear as to whether it was the United Fruit Company or a subsidiary. But on his way to work, along with 3 or 4 other individuals, he was struck by a drunk driver who had stolen a car and continued drinking and then hit this car. 2 of the passengers and the driver died instantly, and Louis Jimenez survived but was paralyzed. He was taken to the nearest hospital, which was Martin Memorial Hospital, which is a not-for-profit private hospital. And he was given life-saving treatment, was in a coma for a period of time, woke up, and they had sent him to essentially the only place that would take him in the area, which was more or less a nursing facility and for the elderly. And the reason why they took him as a patient is that at the time it appeared that he was going to get compensation from the corporation whose car had been stolen by the drunk who had hit him. So they thought that they would get some payout. It turned out that there was no liability, and so there was no money. And so at that point, they kind of ignored him. He then suffered bed sores so deep that they thought that when he came in again that they'd have to give him life-saving treatment. They gave him life-saving treatment again. And then he was there for a total of, I believe, between 5 and 7 years, to which point the board of directors of the hospital intervened and asked a court to establish guardianship so that they could figure out what to do with him. So individuals don't get access, as you're saying, to medical care or coverage. The hospital gets reimbursed for monies that they spend for emergency care. So when they first brought Louis Jimenez in, it didn't matter that he was documented or not. He was an emergency patient, and they gave him emergency care. However, within America's healthcare system at that time, and still today, there is no funding for post-emergency care. So there's a question as to whether he was still receiving emergency care or not. But the hospital had maxed out on what the government will provide for emergency care. So at that point is when the hospital is taking on financial responsibility for him. But that said, every dollar they spent is a business expense. So it's not, they're taking a loss, but not necessarily in the way that you would think of like a bakery or a, you know, bodega. Originally, so actually it's a little more complicated than that. I was working on a law review article about just kind of what would have happened to Louis Jimenez if he would have been in a different jurisdiction. And there happened to be 3 or 4 different ways that the appellate courts look at this situation. So there's a law called EMTALA, which is specific for emergency care and is supposed to prevent something called patient dumping. And originally it was intended to prevent local patient dumping. So citizens who didn't have health insurance or money to pay for medical care would show up to the emergency room, and the hospital would just wheel them right back out and put them on the street. In some cases in LA, they were putting them into ambulances and then dropping them off in a drug area called Skid Row, and just kind of letting them fend for themselves. So Congress passed a law to prevent this and established that in order for a hospital to get rid of a patient, they would have to treat, stabilize, and screen and stabilize the patient before they would move on. The courts have come to different definitions of what the word stabilize means. So there's a question of whether he was stable or not. While I was doing my research, in legal research, one thing you have to do is kind of make sure that the cases are up to date. So I tried to make sure that the case was up to date to see what had happened with his case, and I couldn't find anything through the normal research channels. So I did something, having experience working in a law firm, that normally doesn't work. But I called down to the lawyer who was representing the case and was able to establish a phone interview with him. He then invited me to come down and watch part of the trial where the family was suing the hospital for essentially kidnapping, but in legal terms it's called false imprisonment. When I went down there, I realized that the story was much bigger than I had originally thought, that this was a common issue. And that the ins and outs were a little bit more complicated, and that's when I started considering more of the rule of law questions. In other words, does the law continue to function if it doesn't apply equally to everyone? And so even though politically he or others might have a immigration status that derives from either Congress or the state legislature, that implies that they are higher than the rule of law itself. So there's a larger legal question that has more to do with the authoritative ability of state legislatures, Congress, and courts to essentially deport people when that's not within their constitutional power, if that makes sense. So one of the things, there was 2 kind of parts to that. One is that I found that there was a very large undocumented community in Florida, and what struck me about that was that while the political debate seems to be about trying to quote-unquote identify, document, and find undocumented immigrants, these communities are not secret. And so it was very confusing, and there were reports that police officers and agents round them up, put them in jail overnight, and then let them go. And so this becomes kind of a larger issue that I really wanted to get into. But first, the question that was pressing on my mind, when I saw the conditions that undocumented immigrants were living in, just a short drive away from one of the wealthiest places in the world, Palm Beach, right, Florida, is why would someone go through all of that trouble to leave their country, risk their life, leave their family, come to America, work as hard as they do, and then to be treated this way, which is basically not like a human. So I was curious, so I needed to see for myself the process. Secondly, there was a larger consideration where the story was a little suspicious to me. I was a little skeptical about what the hospital had done with Louis when they dropped him off at Guatemala City, because I had a contact down there that more or less said that what the hospital said they did was impossible, that it's not physically possible for them to have done what they did. So what I wanted to do was go find Louis, try and see if I could get more of the background, and really track how would he have gotten from the airport in Guatemala City to the highlands in northern Guatemala. And so I arranged to go down there for those two purposes, to go try to find him and see if he was still alive, see if he was okay, see if he was better. One of the principal issues in the case was whether he was sent to Guatemala and it would cause what's called a material deterioration of his condition. To me, it seemed like it was common sense that going from an American hospital, going to Guatemala, which doesn't have a very developed healthcare system, there's no way his condition couldn't have got worse. So I wanted to go see whether this is the case, and then probably from a more humanitarian side, what could be done to help him, if anything. I've had experience working with undocumented immigrants and similarly situated peoples in multiple states, and I would say it's different in every state. So having experience with undocumented immigrants in New York is a little bit, they seem to be more under or in the shadows, I would say, right? So often, living situations are not ideal. Trying to find an apartment from somewhere where you don't need a credit check, where you don't need bank statements is difficult in New York. Compare that to Florida, which is more rural and more open. Looks more like shacks, basically. So the conditions are different. They're worse in some ways, and then they're better in other ways. So I would say, in general, what I was kind of shocked to find out in Indiantown is that there was some of the highest levels in Florida of HIV, of curable diseases, general cleanliness, STDs, asthma. I mean, just kind of working conditions and living conditions would not satisfy the requirements and regulations that the federal and local governments have set forward for citizens. So that's what struck me, is that within the United States, there are communities who are living below the radar of what Americans would tolerate. The only connection we had to the location where Louis was the name of the town, provided by a Jesuit Catholic priest who was involved, and then the lawyers. Unfortunately, the name of the town is a common name, so we had a general idea. Then the only real connection we had was to the Catholic Church itself, which was a loose connection. So we knew the name of the priest of the Catholic Church in the parish of that town. Short of that, we didn't know anything else. So it was a series of kind of going from place to place to get closer, and then as we got closer, trying to kind of more or less navigate, not necessarily where, but how to get there. So it was a series of what is termed locally as chicken buses, which are subpar vehicles that often are driven by teenagers or elderly men, and basically carry many of the field workers and laborers throughout Guatemala from different places. So there might be 16 stops, but they're pretty random. They're not actual stops. So they'll stop on the side of the road, two people get out with their gear, and then they'll walk away. So trying to basically piece together enough of those kind of trips to keep going. So we were lucky enough to, while we were waiting in a place, Huehuetenango, we were able to get enough information from local community members to figure out which chicken bus would be the best chicken bus to get us to where we were actually trying to get, with the understanding that we'd have to do some walking and some interesting coordination of trying to find somebody to be able to come pick us up. And so, in short, it was extremely difficult, but we were able to more or less take the same journey that a Mayan or Spanish-speaking person in Guatemala would have to take just to get from Guatemala City to the highlands, to this particular town. We had stops along the way, and we worked with different kind of communities and different kind of advocates along the way. If we were to try to do it a straight shot, assuming that we could catch all the buses and random trucks, I would say probably I'd have to check my record, but I would say it would take at least a day, if not 2 solid days, to get there reasonably. The village itself. The nice way of saying it would be it's under development, and some places have more than others. His family, where he's staying, from what I understood, he was forced to move, and it wasn't clear why. But he moved from one house to another house, and this house was his sister's husband's house, from what I could gather. And this house is not a house in the way that we think of a house. It was an unfinished house, so it was 2 rooms, both fairly large. One was maybe 60 feet by 20 feet, and the other one was more or less the kitchen, and it was maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. And dirt floors, no doors, no windows, windows, but no window pane. Limited kind of like corn kind of growing in the field next to the house. It's up on a hill. And then Louis Jimenez's living situation is that he sleeps on a single-sized bed, no mattress, and directly underneath a window, and that's more or less his only connection to the outside world. He's got some kind of contraption that was donated by a doctor, I believe, that basically helps his elderly mother help him get up to go to the bathroom, basically. He suffered brain damage and now has the cognitive ability of about an 8-year-old. He has some recollection of the event. He has a family that is in another town, a more tourist kind of type town, but he has no connection or communication with them. To my understanding, it didn't seem like they know that he's there. He complains of back pain, which is either a phantom pain or it's a positive sign that he's made some unusual progress and has feeling where he didn't have before. But more or less, I would say that he's like a sick child. He has some children's books, and that's about it. I mean, I think it's amazing. I would say, kind of, from what I gathered from my time in Mayan communities, was that there's more of a collective effort. And so one of the problems is that because Louis Jimenez can't join the collective, because he doesn't have any ability to kind of help himself or help others, that he's more or less outcast. So that's, she didn't talk about it, but it was pretty obvious that she also is outcast, and so she's basically his nurse all day. So with that said, he doesn't move around much. So it's more of just getting him his meals. He does some stretches, and then I think just trying to keep him present.
Yeah. Is there any type of access to healthcare for him?
I mean, there could be. I mean, certainly, the easiest thing would be just for American doctors could very easily go down, and there could be some physical rehabilitation as well as some brain rehabilitation. But who's going to pay for it, I think, is the question. The hospital that they sent him to, anecdotally, was a mental hospital, which mostly were filled with just kind of whatever needed in Guatemala City. However, when we went by, the hospital was closed, and it wasn't really a hospital in the way we think of a hospital, as more as just a one-story building. There's an incredible amount of violence in Guatemala City, and the particular building, the building surrounding the hospital building showed evidence of gunfire. So, medical treatment is a privilege for the rich, and the doctors for the rich, come to their homes. Guatemala City is unlike any city I've ever seen before. It looks like a military zone. There are large policemen with, automatic weapons. There are guards pretty much everywhere. Private companies hire their own guards, armed guards. There's wire and fences surrounding, restaurants. I mean, when you go eat dinner, you go in through a gate and you're in like a little strip mall, and there's armed guards basically watching over you. So healthcare is, hit or miss. But in the rural area where he's at, I mean, there's no healthcare to speak of. There's a doctor comes and stretches him. That's the extent of the healthcare he gets. He has seizures, and there's just got to get through it, I guess. I don't know what his situation is now. I mean, there's no communication. They don't have a phone. They don't have a TV. They don't have the internet. The only way of knowing would be to contact the Catholic Church that's there and have them go check on it. At the very least, I'd like people who are engaged in the immigration debate but might not understand it generally to see the story from beginning to end of what were the reasons why people like Luis Jimenez come to the United States in the first place, what do they actually get when they get here, what can happen to them legally and extra legally, and then what's that journey like going back. I'd like people to at least have that understanding before they make a decision on how they feel about immigration. Secondly, my research is in the rule of law, and one concept would be that essentially to deny somebody their dignity as a human goes beyond the scope of what most people would consider the purpose of the rule of law. So at the very least, humans should be treated equally in the sense of their dignity. So in this sense, for him to be discarded as if he were a piece of bad fruit struck me the wrong way, in the sense of how, if we're willing to do that to someone we have identified as a non-citizen, it doesn't seem like it would be a far stretch to do that to citizens. And so through my research, I found out that it does happen to United States citizens as well. So I think what I'd like people to understand is that this story is not specific to undocumented immigrants nor documented immigrants, but all people living in the United States can be denied health care and are more or less subject to deportation by a private corporation simply because they're